I want to talk to you today about my career journey that led me from being discharged from the Army to MCrider. In the process, there have been some mountaintop experiences and some times where I spent in the valley, and I thought it would be a great topic for this week's video. I hope you get something from this story. As many of you know, my early goal in life was to become a chaplain in the U.S. Army. I enlisted in the Army in 1985, served as a soldier in the Field Artillery Unit. I was later commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Military Police Corps, and I had worked full-time, sometimes 2 or 3 jobs while going to college and working on my master's degree full-time for 7 years while my goal of becoming a chaplain in the Army. And if you watch my video on that story of my eye, then you already understand how that ended. But to keep it short, I got to the end of a long educational journey to become a chaplain, only to lose vision in my left eye due to an accident and no longer qualify for military service. But today I want to speak to you about all the dark times that followed that incident, but the hope that I found in my faith in God that got me through all of that. I hear from some of you from time to time that you're going through some dark times as well, and I hope my story will inspire you to keep moving forward. When my military options ended, I worked for several years in the mental health field. I worked with adults with multiple personality disorder. I worked with people who were raised in cults and used in sadistic rituals and Satanism and Satan worship. I worked with addicts. I worked with kids involved in gangs and drugs. I visited homes of grandmothers who were trying to raise a dozen kids who were dropped off at her house because their parents, her children, were involved in gangs, drugs, and other illegal enterprises. I visited kids in juvenile detention centers who were constantly being kicked out of school due to their behavior. I visited with teenagers in jails for charges like robbery and rape. I remember one family who had very little social skills, none of them had a job, and no ability to parent the dozens of kids that they seemed like they had running around their trailer all the time. They lived in this dilapidated mobile home with their children who slept on the floor. They applied for and got governmental assistance, and after several months they were given a lump sum check and back pay since they had first applied for assistance. So they received a check and a lump sum of $20,000, and they quickly spent it all on an above-ground pool, 4-wheelers, and bicycles for all the kids. Well, that pool was soon beyond repair. The 4-wheelers and bikes were destroyed, and the kids still slept on the floor. Needless to say, my career in the mental health field, I saw a lot. I saw a lot of people who were hurting, and to be honest, I saw a lot of other broken and hurting people who were trying with very little positive effect to help those people who were at the end of their rope. In working in all that despair, I ultimately found some hope, at least in my sense of understanding of where our true hope comes from. After several years of doing this type of work, I needed a change of pace, and I started a career journey in computers and web development. You see, while I worked in the mental health field, I picked up a hobby. It was right at the start of the internet, and I wanted to learn how this whole internet thing worked out, and I got some free hosting space with the internet service provider that I had signed up with, and I started teaching myself how to develop websites. Back in those days, internet service providers were small businesses on street corners. You could walk in the door, sign up for internet service. They gave you a phone number to call. You had to use your phone in order to get on the internet. You called in, dialed in, entered your username and password, and off to the World Wide Web you went. I signed up with a company called EasyNet that was based in Arlington, Texas, and they gave you a few megabytes of storage to host a web page on their server. I wanted to learn how to do this, so I bought a few books on how to make websites and started learning how to create one on my own. First, I wasn't sure what I wanted the web page to be about, but I'd always been a fan of the LA Rams football team, so I bought the domain name ramsfootball.com. And even though I don't do anything with it, I still own that domain to this day. I started learning to create a website and put things out there that were interesting to me, at least, as a fan of the Rams. I wrote some articles. I linked to other articles about the Rams. I even did some digital art so that fans could download it and use it as wallpaper on their own computer. This was back before Google was even in existence, and Yahoo was the king, but even Yahoo was a bunch of hand-curated links to other pages on the internet. There was no algorithm that went out and found things for you. I finally got Rams football listed on Yahoo, but I had no idea what the reach of the site was or how many people were coming into the website because there weren't analytics easily available. That is, until one day I walked into EasyNet to pay my bill. The guy at the counter said, "Wait a minute, did you say your name is Kevin Morris?" I said, "Yes." He said, "The guy that runs RamsFootball.com?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Please move your webpage somewhere else. You're killing us." I looked kind of confused at him, and he walked me back to what I guess you'd call a server room, but it was just a bunch of modems and routers strung together with computers in between. And he went on to tell me that 90% of the traffic that comes through this room is RamsFootball.com. The other 10% of the traffic is all of the other hundreds of web pages that they host, and their own business website for that matter. So for EasyNet, RamsFootball.com accounted for 90% of their total traffic. And I had no clue that it was getting that kind of traffic because I said before there were no analytics. There were random page counters that worked sometimes and sometimes didn't work. So he said, "Please move your web page to somewhere else. We know we offer free hosting, but we never planned on something like this." So I wasn't making any money off of Rams football. I was just doing it for the learning experience and because I was enjoying it. Since I was enjoying the experience, I paid out of my own pocket to find another host for Rams football. And back in those days, there were these things called magazines. Some of you might even remember them. They were kind of like a print version of the internet that you had to go to the store and actually buy them. And Rams football was featured in a few of these internet magazines. And yeah, as weird as it sounds now, there were actual magazines in print that helped people find what was available online. So kind of weird when you actually think about it. I had a write-up in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Right here in the heart of Cowboys country, they wrote an article featuring RamsFootball.com. I ended up using my experience developing Rams football as kind of a resume to begin my career in web development. I didn't know it at the time, but all of that experience was something that God was using to prepare me for something else far into the future. I didn't fully understand the career roller coaster that I was climbing on board, but I was off to the races in the web development world. Life, it seems, is a series of mountaintops and valleys. Those mountaintops are great, the air's fresh, the light's good, you get up to the top of it, but then you begin to descend down into the valley. The valleys are dark and cold, the path is hard to find, and doubt creeps in. But the valley is where our faith is tested. The valley is where hard but true lessons are taught. And for me, I think God sending me through those valleys, He did so in order to teach me faith. You know, faith is a word that many people misunderstand. Faith is not believing in something that's unbelievable. You don't have blind faith. There is no such thing as blind faith. Faith is closer to trust, and God wanted me to fully trust Him, and I had not learned yet how to do that. And to be honest, I'm still learning how to do that every day. My first valley, the one that after my eye injury, was deep and dark, and it took me a long time to come through the other side of that. It wasn't pleasant, and oftentimes I tried to climb out on my own strength only to slide back down. I only needed faith. I only needed to trust. So I started my career in the computer industry, and one of the first big jobs that I got was in the .com startup called Digital Convergence. If you're around back then, you may even remember them. They were the people that made the QCat. In fact, I've got one, it's out of focus. I've got a QCat on my wall back there as a memento for my days at Digital Convergence. But the QCat was basically a digital barcode reader. It connected print articles to the web. So you scanned a little barcode, QCat would read that barcode, and it would send you to an associated website with that. We had contracts with Forbes, Coca-Cola, Radio Shack, several magazines, and book publishers. I was about the 30th employee hired, and we quickly grew to hundreds of employees with offices in Dallas, New York, and London. It was right at the start of the .com bubble, and we were living large. And as a bonus, I was given several hundred pre-shares of stock in the company that I was told would be worth millions of dollars in a few years. But just as the company was about to go public, that dot-com bubble burst, and digital convergence was not performing as expected, and massive layoffs started. As I said, digital convergence was huge at this time, and I was seated in a sea of other cubicles with a few other people who were in that web marketing aspects of digital convergence like I was. And every day people around us were being plucked from their seats for a meeting at HR, only never to return. The reps from HR would show up at their cubicle with a cart, tell them to load their belongings on board, and off the hapless employee would go, and they'd never return to their seat. But that cart was kind of a morbid joke with me and a friend of mine who sat next to me, because the cart had some squeaky wheels on it, and you could hear that thing coming all the way across the building. We'd be seated doing our work, and in the distance you'd hear that cart round the corner, and I'd say, "Hey Mike, you go one way, I'll go the other way. They can't catch both of us." And we'd laugh about it, but in reality we'd kind of sit there anxiously for a few minutes until that cart passed by our row of cubicles, and then we could breathe a little bit easier. The bad part was they used the same cart to deliver the mail on, so you never knew if that cart had stacks of mail on it or room for all of your stuff until they showed up at your cubicle. Hundreds of employees were whittled down to about 50 over a few weeks and months of squeaky cartwheels, and I was one of the few remaining employees for whom the cart had not arrived. One day I arrived at work and I got on the elevator and I looked, and they actually had a sign posted on the elevator door, "Office supplies for sale." And I knew for sure that my fate was sealed when I saw that. And the bad part was the first employees who were laid off received severance packages. By the time they got to me, they were selling the paper clips and staplers, and there was no money left for severance. So I was on my own. I was in another valley. This valley was not as long as the prior, but it did come at a tough time because the economy was bad and there were many more jobs being eliminated than being created. A friend of mine who I worked with at Digital Convergence invited me for an interview at a subprime mortgage company that he had landed at. And I thought to myself, what could possibly go wrong in a subprime mortgage company, right? Right. I worked for a few years at this company, and they were honestly some of my more enjoyable years working in the web field. I was surrounded by good people, I had a great job, and my work mattered to the people I worked for. One of the great things about working here was the company asked me if I would learn to do video production to make some training videos for the HR department. So I learned all about video production, how to edit videos, how to set up lighting, and how to communicate clearly and simply in video. Sound familiar? So I was on another mountaintop. But for me, all those mountaintops are followed by a valley, and after a few years of this, subprime mortgage industry began to crumble. There were too many bad loans, too much governmental tinkering led to a shaky industry, and the mortgage industry's only means of survival was to consolidate. So all over the country, mortgage mergers were happening as companies consolidated. I arrived at work one day and there was a surprise all-company conference scheduled for 10 a.m. that morning. But here's the kicker. We had an email in our inbox telling us that there were two separate conference rooms, and each of us were invited to either conference room A or conference room B. So people quickly began comparing notes and finding out who they were in the room with at 10 a.m. It was easy to figure out who some of the slackers were and likely to be laid off, and there was a little bit of relief if you weren't in the same conference room with them, and you just hoped that the management saw it the same way you did. So I arrived in conference room A and was told with the others in that room that our job was safe. They asked us to stay in that room for 60 minutes. They had donuts and coffee for us, but we stayed there for 60 minutes so conference room B could gather the things and leave the building. To say the least, it was a little bit awkward. So we were merging with another company, and they were moving the headquarters to Virginia. To make a long story short, I was offered a job in Virginia, but no pay raise to move. They were not covering the expense of the move, and the cost of living was considerably higher in Virginia. I was told that regardless of my decision, my job was safe, and they wanted me to stay with the company. My wife and I had just had our first child. We'd recently built and purchased a new home, and I decided to stay in Texas. Things were okay for a while, but the magic of the earlier company that I had worked for was gone, and my enjoyable work experience was becoming more like a job. Then the Virginia office started putting some full pressure on me to get me to move to Virginia. I reminded them of what they told me from the beginning, that I could work in Texas, and it was working well, at least I thought so, but they wanted me in Virginia. Again, no raise, it was a higher cost of living, and the move across the country was still on my own dime, so I stuck to my guns, and I realized that it was probably the writing on the wall when I turned them down the second time. At this point, my wife had quit her job as a teacher so that she could stay home with our daughter. We had tried for years to have kids and thought it would never happen. Then when our first child came along, we were over the moon excited, but we both wanted our daughter raised by us, and we made sacrifices to make that happen, even if that meant living on a single income. So I went to work one day, and I was told that they were hiring my position in Virginia with or without me. I told them they'd have to hire it without me, and they asked me to stay on for a few weeks to find and train my replacement. Right? They wanted me to train the person that was replacing me. So since I had no other options, I accepted, and it would give me time to look for another job in the meantime. But it was a scary time. I was in another valley. I was the only one who was working in the family, and I was soon going to be losing my job. But I was convinced that my wife was the best person in the world to raise our daughter, so I'd try to figure this thing out. So I started on my drive home at the end of that day, and I rehearsed conversations in my head how I would tell my wife. I walked in the door. She said, "I got some news for you." I said, "Me too." I said, "You go first." She said, "I'm pregnant again." She was so excited, and I was too. We were always wanting to have 2 children. Couldn't have them for a long time, and now God had provided 2 kids for us. We celebrated for a while, and she said, "Oh yeah, what was your news that you wanted to tell me about?" I said, "Nothing, we'll talk about it later." So in spite of my excitement, the valley that I was in just got a little bit deeper, got a little bit colder, and the path through that valley was a little less clear than it was even when I started my drive home. So I started immediately looking for other jobs. I sent out resumes, I called contacts, I talked to recruiters, and man, I couldn't get a single interview. It was really odd. Nobody at all was calling me back. The weeks passed, my employment was running out with the mortgage company, and my wife was due in about 4 months. The only financial glimmer of hope was that I was getting a severance package, and they would also cover my insurance through the pregnancy. But it was a deep, dark valley mixed with excitement of being a dad again. Then just as my employment was over, my wife got some really bad news. She was told by the doctor that she was at high risk of losing the child and had to be on bed rest for the remainder of her pregnancy, which was about 3 or 4 months. And I think God has a sense of humor, and sometimes it's at our own expense, because now I was out of a job, and I had a wife who couldn't get out of bed, and a daughter who was now walking and in fact running all over the house. And it looked like I was the guy for the job, so I put that outside job search on hold. We cashed in all of our savings, and I became Mr. Mom, and we made it through those few months that culminated in a healthy and seamless birth of our second daughter. Soon after our second child came home, I found a job at American Eagle Airlines. So I had applied for all those months with not a single call back. As soon as our baby was born, and I really needed to get back to work and not stay home and take care of my daughter, God provided. I was making significantly less money, so we sold our dream home that we'd built a few years earlier, and my wife and I, and now our 2 daughters, moved across town to another home that, even though it was smaller, the neighborhood was not quite as good, but it had everything we needed. And I love my time of working at Eagle. I worked in the training department, and we made training materials for the airplane mechanics for the airlines. Now, I don't know a thing about mechanical work on an airplane, but I could take the stuff that other people wrote and create training materials out of that. So God provided another tool that I would need later in my career, making training materials for other people. And it was during this time also that I became a riding instructor for the Motorcycle Safety Foundation. So I was training mechanics in digital format during the week, and I was training new riders on the weekends out in the parking lot. After a few years, I moved from the fantastic work environment at Eagle to another major airline this time, and for a while it seemed like a big mistake, because I went from an easy place to work where the employees supported one another and I felt valued as an employee, to an environment that was highly political, and to be honest, it was just no fun at all. Career-wise, I was in another valley, but I felt like I needed to stay there because it supported my family. I was still teaching MSF classes on the weekend, and I commuted every day to work on a motorcycle, which was the only good part of my workday. There was also an MSF range not too far from where I worked, and I frequently went there over lunch breaks and worked on my riding skills. It was a good way to clear my head from all the minutia that was going on back at work. I had told you earlier about my experience creating ramsfootball.com, and even though I let that site finally fade into non-existence, I had moved on to some other private web endeavors and continued creating websites on topics of personal interest. One of them that I found was the iPhone. It had just been released, and initially, if you remember, the iPhone didn't have any apps on it in the App Store or any other way to put third-party apps on the phone. But I followed tech news closely and began to hear rumors that Apple was working on an app store and a way for third-party apps to be on the platform. So with a little bit of forethought, about 6 months before apps were ever announced for the platform, I bought the domain name iPhoneAppReview.com, and I began working on a review site for iPhone apps, even though there were no apps announced or available for the platform. Once Apple made the huge announcement and apps were announced and released for the iPhone, it was big news, and my site was in prime position to provide some of the news that iPhone owners were looking for out on the web. So I reached out to app developers, everybody that I could find, and I offered them a free way to promote their app on my website. They just had to provide images, screenshots of their app, and a detailed discussion on the functions of their app. So developers were soon providing me all the free content that I could use on a daily basis to fill up my website and help me grow that site in the search engines and in popularity with the public. So I got free content for the website that I used to build an audience, and I used that in turn to develop advertising revenue that was coming into the site. So while iPhone App Review never made a fortune, it was making over $1,000, sometimes $2,000 a month. It was not bad back in the day for a part-time gig and something that I enjoyed doing anyway. I later sold iPhone App Review to some other investors for about $17,000. I used that money to buy what else? A new motorcycle and seed money to start my next idea that was just starting to come into focus. I loved all of my part-time jobs. I loved creating websites. I loved teaching MSF classes, but I was really not happy in the job that paid most of my bills. I really wanted to leave that job at the airlines, but I couldn't see a way to support my family doing what my heart desired to do, which was making training materials for motorcycle riders. I needed a shove to step out in faith, and soon God was going to provide that two-handed shove to me right in the back that would do just that. The airline I was working for announced that they were in a merger. Mergers sometimes are good news for stockholders, but they're often bad news for employees. And we were told that a significant part of the department that I worked in would lose their job. To be honest, I wanted to leave. I had the idea for MCrider, I just didn't have the trust at that time to jump out there on my own. But if I was given a gentle nudge or a two-handed shove in the back, I would take it as a sign. After all, I'd been on mountains before, I'd been through the deepest valleys before, and God was always faithful to me in the past. And I was finally learning to trust. I was finally developing faith. Even though it is a faith smaller than the size of a mustard seed, it's faith and trust nonetheless. So I started to pray about the whole thing. Sometimes, to be honest, praying to keep my job, and sometimes praying to lose my job. And one day I was called into the office and told that my job was going away, but they wanted me to stay on for a few months while they transitioned. So I walked out of that office that day on fire. And I I can't explain the sense of assurance that I had. I can't explain the passion I had. I had a new calling. I couldn't wait to get started on MCrider. I had about 6 months left to work. I was given insurance and severance pay for long enough after that of my employment for me to get MCrider off the ground and to see if it would work. So I started talking to people who are in the motorcycle training industry about what I wanted to do. Some of them showed mild interest. Others said they thought it would never work. But I was undeterred. God had answered my prayer by getting me out of the airline industry, and this was my new direction. I talked to other people who work full-time at YouTube, and I was told that it would take several years to make a living doing this. I didn't have that kind of time. I had maybe 1 year to see if this thing would work. So the day finally arrived for my last day at the airline, and to be honest, that few months of working at the airline was some of my best working there. I had a new boss who I saw much more eye to eye with, and with a new boss that was fair, but my fate still sealed at the airline, I did some of my best work. I didn't want to walk out the door hanging my head down low, so I gave him my best effort for those last few months. And in fact, during that last week of employment there, my new boss called me into his office one day and asked me if I would consider staying. It probably sounded a little bit rude because I gave him a visceral and resounding no to his question when he asked me. He kind of laughed about it and just said, well, you think about it. So when my final day finally came, he looked across the table and said, man, I have never seen anyone so happy about losing their job. Because I had 4 things. I had peace, I had faith, I had trust, and I had a direction. That peace was not learned on the mountaintops. It was learned in the valleys. The valleys, even though they were cold and dark, led me to where I was supposed to go and taught me what I needed to learn. Remember that first valley that led me into the psych field? There I learned about human nature. I learned how to talk to and reach people. It taught me compassion because there for the grace of God go I. Above all else, it showed me where to place my trust and my hope. And it doesn't come from the wisdom of men. When I came out of that second valley, it led me to the .com startup where I learned my web development and graphic design skills. That third valley led me to the mortgage company where I got to learn video development and video editing and lighting. Then that fourth valley led me to the airlines where I created online training materials for mechanics. That final valley led me right here, where I took everything I had learned in every other valley and on top of every other mountain, and I took that two-handed shove out the door, and it led me straight to MCrider. So I've been doing MCrider now for almost 7 years. And remember the others who told me that MCrider wouldn't work? Well, I think it has. Remember the others who said it would take several years for me to make a living doing this? Well, before my severance even ran out with the airlines, I was already making more money than I ever did in the airline industry. God blessed the effort, and I trusted in God because He had proved His reliance in the past. So it all comes back to faith. Remember, faith is not blind. True faith is trust. But the thing about trust is it matters immensely who or what you put your trust in. There are all kinds of things that we can trust in that only lead to a deeper and darker valley. I can say with full assurance that I know where my trust is today. There are still valleys. It's not always easy, but I do know if you trust in the one who is trustworthy, He will always lead you to the other side of your valley. As strange as it may seem, you can climb that near side of the mountain after you've come through the valley. You can stop and look back over your shoulder at the valley and say thank you. And I want to say thank you to you for supporting me on this channel and for letting me come on here every week, talk about motorcycles, sometimes talk about life.